I was Googling things off of the internet, and I came across this phrase: too humble is half proud. It's apparently an old Yiddish proverb, but it brings up an interesting question. Can we have too much pride? Or can we be too humble? Can we have too much humility? Well, let's look at some scriptures. We can go to Colossians 3:12, and I'll just read it. Colossians 3:12 says, to clothe yourself in humility. Sounds like we can have quite a bit of humility here. Although I guess you can argue, you can always put on too much clothes. Okay, well, let's turn to another scripture, or I'll just read another scripture. Micah 6:8. What does God require of you but to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? So we have to walk humbly. But I guess you could say you can get tired of walking, right? Everybody has to sleep sometime. Well, what about Ephesians 4 and verse 2? I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk. Okay, we're walking again. Worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long-suffering, bearing with one another in love. With all lowliness. Lowliness, we know, is a similar term to humility. It's one that's translated into humility often. Other translations of the Bible will help us understand a little bit more the fuller meaning of this word. So in the New Living Translation, it says, always being humble. In the New International, it says, be completely humble. Doesn't seem to leave a lot of wiggle room. Before we clothe ourselves, then we walk humbly. But now, in Ephesians 4 and verse 2, it says, with all lowliness. Always being humble. Being completely humble. So it doesn't sound like we can be too humble. Okay, so let's go to the best example of humility in the Bible, right? Moses, said to be the most humble man to ever walk the face of the earth. Surely we'll be able to answer this question with the account of his life. So let's turn this time to Exodus chapter 4. Turn to Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to let's start with the first conversation between Moses and God at the burning bush. So we'll go to Exodus chapter 4, and let's just break into the conversation in verse 10. So in verse 10, here it says, then Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you spoke to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, and the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with you and your mouth, and teach you what you shall say. But he said, O Lord, please send by thy hand of whoever else you may send. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth. And I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. We can stop there. But let's wait a second. The Lord was angry with Moses? Wasn't Moses supposed to be the most humble man to ever live? And yet Moses says here, I'm not eloquent, neither before or since you have spoken to me. That sounds maybe a little humble. I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue. And even after all of those, he says, please take anyone else. It was after that that the Lord was angered against Moses. So was Moses being too humble here? Well, if we are to be always completely humble, then Moses must not have been humble here. Otherwise, the Lord would not have been angry with him. So Moses wasn't being humble here because he became always completely humble. But he wasn't. Not yet. So let's look at 2 points in Moses' life, 2 stops in the road, we could say, and try to learn how Moses became and to gain this godly humility. So the first stop on the road, let's hold our place in Exodus first, because we'll be back. But just to get a little bit more of an understanding of where we're going in Moses' life, let's turn to Romans 12, just to understand the concept. So let's turn over to Romans 12. Now, right after Paul says that, we should not conform to this world, but instead be transforming our minds, right after that in verse 3, he says this, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." So we're not to think of ourselves too highly. But right after that, what are we to do? But we are to think soberly. The word that is translated think soberly is a Greek word that I have tried to remember how to pronounce, and I'm not going to do it. Strong's numbers is 4993. Now, Strong's gives an okay definition, a basic definition of the word. And it means to be sound mind or to be temperate. But I think you can get a more well-rounded view of the word from Greek scholars who have studied other types of writings. So if you studied the writings of Heraclitus, if you studied the words of Heraclitus, who was a Greek philosopher, you would understand that this word, 4993 in the Strong's dictionary, has a more deeper meaning to it. It means instead of to be sound mind, or as well as to be of sound mind and temperate, it also means balanced, thoughtful reasoning. So having a balanced thought with yourself. So let's read that scripture one more time. In verse 3, "For I say, through the grace that is given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself too highly, but to think soberly, or to think balanced in thoughtful reason, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." So we should be balanced with our thoughts towards ourselves. We shouldn't think of ourselves too highly, but we shouldn't think of ourselves too lowly either. So, if you've held your spot in Exodus in verse 4, we're going to go back there. So, Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4, when the Lord speaks to Moses through the burning bush, Moses was thinking of himself too lowly. Even when the Lord himself said, "Who has made man's mouth? Or what makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth." Even after the Lord said that he was going to be with him, Moses thought too low of himself and said, "Take someone else." That's our first step in Moses' road to godly humility. He wasn't being humble. He wasn't being balanced in thoughtful reason with himself. Our second stop on Moses' road to godly humility, we're going to stop in a place in Numbers chapter 20. Now, this is a story that we're all familiar with. Numbers in chapter 20. This is probably the point of Moses' story that he is the least proud of. And it's recorded for us. And it's recorded for a reason. So, in verse 7, we'll pick up the story. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, you and your brother, Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water from the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, and as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring forth water out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly in to the land which I have given them." So, not Moses' most proud moments. Here, Moses thought too highly of himself. He said, "Must we bring water out of the rock?" He put himself in place of God. He wasn't being humble. Moses was called the most humble man to walk the face of the earth. And we see that he had his highs, but he also had his lows. He thought too highly of himself at times, but he also thought too lowly of himself before he even became a servant of God. Moses had moments where he thought too low and too high, but he was called the most humble man to walk the face of the earth. So, what made him that man? You can take your pick. Those balanced and thoughtful reason with himself came up more times than not. When Moses was on top of the mountain with God, speaking and bringing down the 10 Commandments, and God said, "I'm going to destroy these people," Moses pleaded against that and for those people, showing true humility to God. When the tribes plotted against him and wanted to overthrow him as the leader, and God again said, "I'm going to destroy these people," Moses interceded on their behalf. Time and time again, if you read through the story of Moses, he intercedes on others' behalf, showing true, complete, all humility, understanding who he was, his strengths, his weaknesses, the position that God had put him in, but also understanding God and who God is. That is balanced understanding. So, let's go back to the burning bush. Moses wasn't being humble at all there, but he came to be completely humble. Not without mistake, but learned to be completely humble time and time again, as the most humble man to ever live. As we enter the spring holy days, and as it's on our minds, let's try to be sober-minded. Take a true humble approach to ourselves, weighing our strengths, and not only thinking on our weaknesses. Don't think too highly of yourself, but also don't think too lowly of yourself. By being sober-minded, we can take a humble account of ourselves and make our needed changes. And then, just as Moses went up to the top of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, where Lord giving him a glance just of the promise that the people were going to cross over, we might also see the promises laid before us. Can we be too humble? No. But we can be humble enough to work on ourselves just as Moses did.